The wilderness is a mirror, reflecting the deepest parts of a man's soul. His fears, his desires, his fragility. For Samuel Chio, the Gila National Forest in New Mexico was meant to be a sanctuary, a place to mend the wounds of a broken life. Instead, it became a crucible, forging a nightmare that would haunt him for years to come. In 2013, Samuel took a job as a fire lookout, seeking solitude in the rugged expanse of the Gila. What he found was a darkness that lurked beneath the earth, a horror that whispered through the pines and left scars on his mind. This is his story, a descent into the abyss of the wilds, where the forest itself becomes a predator, and the shadows hold secrets too terrible to name. As you journey through this tale, ask yourself, could you endure the isolation of a fire tower, knowing something malevolent watches from the trees? Would you have the courage to descend into the unknown, even if it meant facing the unspeakable? The Solitude of Tower 4, A Man and His Ghosts. Samuel Chio was a man adrift, a shipwrecked soul seeking refuge from the storms of his past. A brutal divorce had stripped him of his home, his stability, and his sense of self. The drinking that followed, a bottle of whiskey a night, sometimes more, had nearly drowned him, leaving him hollowed out, a husk of the man he'd once been. When the Forest Service offered him a position as a fire lookout in the Gila National Forest, it felt like a lifeline, a chance to rebuild in the quiet embrace of solitude. The Gila is a vast, untamed wilderness, a labyrinth of deep canyons, sharp cliffs, and endless pines that stretch toward the horizon like a sea of green daggers. It's a place where the earth remembers. Ancient tribes who carved petroglyphs into the rocks, miners who vanished into the canyons, and things that should not exist but do. Samuel's post, Tower 4, was perched near Malyan Baldy, a remote ridge where the roads were little more than scars in the earth, too treacherous even for the Forest Service's battered trucks. Supplies were airdropped once a month, a parachute fluttering down with crates of canned goods, water, and batteries. Communication was limited to a crackling radio and a landline for emergencies, its cord frayed from years of neglect. There was no cell service, no Wi-Fi, just Samuel, the tower, and the wind that howled through the night like a dying animal, its mournful wail echoing through the canyons. The tower itself was a relic, a weathered sentinel that had stood for decades, its wooden frame creaking under the weight of time. It rose 60 feet above the forest floor, a narrow cabin perched atop a lattice of beams, offering a panoramic view of the wilderness. The cabin was Spartan, a 10 by 10 space that smelled of pine and mildew. A cot with a threadbare blanket sat in one corner, its springs groaning with every movement. A desk, cluttered with maps, logbooks, and a pair of scratched binoculars, occupied the center of the room. A propane stove, its metal stained with years of use, sat on a small counter, where Samuel brewed his morning coffee. A single window, its glass smudged with grime, offered a view of the forest below, the pines stretching out like an endless army of sentinels. A pistol, a heavy .45 that felt like an extension of Samuel's forearm, rested in a locked case. Its only use had been to dispatch a rattlesnake that had slithered too close one sweltering afternoon, its hiss a warning that Samuel had answered with a single shot. For months, Samuel's days were a monotony of routine, a rhythm that became his anchor. He'd wake at dawn, the first light creeping over the horizon, painting the pines in shades of gold and amber. He'd brew a pot of coffee, the bitter aroma filling the cabin, and sit at his desk, scanning the horizon for smoke. His logbook was a record of the mundane. August 12, 2013. Clear skies, 72 degrees, light breeze from the west. No smoke sighted. The radio would crackle occasionally with updates from the ranger station 20 miles away, a voice named Manuel offering terse reports, or the occasional joke about the weather. "Hot enough for you, Tower 4? Manuel would say, his voice distorted by static. Samuel would chuckle, the sound hollow in the empty cabin, and reply, "Hot enough to fry an egg on the deck." The nights were long, the kind of quiet that sinks into your bones, broken only by the wind's mournful wail or the distant cry of a coyote. Samuel would sit by the window, a tattered paperback in his hands. Mostly westerns, their pages yellowed and dog-eared, and lose himself in tales of cowboys and outlaws. The solitude was a balm, soothing the jagged edges of his past. But it was also a weight, pressing down on him with every passing day. He'd lie on his cot at night, staring at the ceiling, the wood grain forming patterns that seemed to shift in the dim light of his lantern. Sometimes, he'd hear things, snaps of twigs, rustles in the underbrush, that made him sit up, his heart pounding, but it was always nothing. Just the forest, he told himself, just the wind. But the Gila National Forest is not a place that tolerates peace for long. It's a wilderness with a memory, a place where the earth itself seems to whisper secrets. The locals in Silver City, the nearest town, spoke of strange things in hushed tones. Hikers who vanished without a trace, lights in the sky that moved too fast to be planes, and creatures that stalked the canyons, their eyes glowing in the dark. Samuel had dismissed these stories as folklore, the kind of tales told to scare greenhorns. He'd come to the Gila to escape, not to chase ghosts. But the forest had other plans. The smoke that shouldn't have been, a fire with no spark. It was a Wednesday in late August, the air heavy with the scent of pine resin and sun-warmed earth, when the first sign of trouble appeared. Samuel was at his desk, sipping coffee that had gone cold, his eyes scanning the horizon out of habit. That's when he noticed it. A thin gray line smudging the horizon to the northwest, a delicate thread rising from the forest like a ghost. He grabbed his binoculars, the lenses scratched but functional, and focused on the anomaly. The smoke was faint, barely more than a whisper, but it was unmistakable. Fires were his job, his reason for being in the tower, so he noted the coordinates about 6 miles out near Sector 17 and radioed the ranger station. Tower 4 to base. I've got smoke to the northwest, near Sector 17. Looks small, but it's there, he said, his voice steady despite the flicker of unease in his gut. Fires were common in the Gila, especially in late summer when the forest was tinder dry, but something about this one felt off. There had been no lightning storms in the area for weeks, no campers permitted in that sector, and no prescribed burns scheduled. Fires needed a spark, and Samuel couldn't find one. The response was immediate but curt, a voice cutting through the static like a blade. Roger that, Tower 4. Stay put. No follow-up, no good catch, Sam. No keep an eye on it. Just static, buzzing in his ears like a swarm of insects. It was odd, but not alarming, not yet. Samuel chalked it up to a busy day at the station. Maybe a new dispatcher who didn't know the usual protocol. He turned his attention back to the smoke, watching as it thickened over the hours, its gray tendrils curling upward like the fingers of a ghost. By late afternoon, the smoke had grown into a column, a dark plume that stood out against the pale blue sky. Through his binoculars, Samuel could see flames licking through the forest, their orange tongues devouring the pines, turning them into black skeletons. The fire was moving fast, too fast, its speed defying the laws of nature. Samuel had seen fires before, wildfires that roared through the forest like a freight train, driven by wind and fuel, but this was different. There was no wind that day, no gusts to fan the flames, and the forest in that sector was sparse, not dense enough to sustain such a blaze. It didn't make sense. He radioed again, his voice tighter this time, the unease in his gut growing into a knot. Tower 4 to base, the fire's growing. I can see flames now.
No lightning, no campers.
What's going on? Static. No response. He tried the emergency landline next, the relic of a phone that hung on the wall, its rotary dial clicking with each turn. He dialed the ranger station's number, the line ringing out into nothingness, a hollow echo that seemed to stretch into infinity. Samuel slammed the receiver down, his hands trembling, and turned back to the window. The fire was still there, its glow a malevolent eye in the distance, watching him. That night, Samuel didn't sleep. He sat by the window, his binoculars pressed to his face, watching the distant glow of the fire. It was unnatural, not just in its origin but in how it moved. Fires spread chaotically, driven by wind and fuel, but this one seemed deliberate, as if it were following a pattern, carving shapes into the forest. He watched as the flames traced a jagged arc, then doubled back, forming what looked like a crude spiral, a shape that seemed to pulse with intent. It was impossible, he told himself. He was being paranoid, probably from too much coffee and too little sleep. But the shapes were there, etched in fire, and they sent a shiver down his spine that had nothing to do with the chill of the night. At dawn, the radio crackled to life, the sound jolting Samuel from his vigil. Tower 4, we're sending a team out to investigate. Stay at your post. It was the same monotone voice as before, no names, no chatter, just the command. Samuel replied, "Understood." But his gut was already knotting up. The voice on the radio was too cold, too detached, as if it belonged to someone or something that didn't care whether he lived or died. He tried to shake the thought, but it clung to him like a shadow, following him through the day. The contractors and the restricted zone. Shadows in the forest. Around mid-morning, Samuel spotted movement below, a flicker of color against the green of the forest floor. 2 men were hiking up the dirt path toward his tower, their figures small but distinct. They were dressed in fire-resistant gear, the kind of yellow Nomex suits worn by wildfire crews, but something was off. They carried no helmets, no radios, no tools, just backpacks that sagged with an unknown weight, and a strange, purposeful stride that set Samuel's nerves on edge. He stepped onto the tower's deck, the wood creaking beneath his boots, and leaned over the railing, the wind tugging at his jacket. "You the lookout?" The shorter man called up, his voice flat, his face tanned and leathery, etched with lines that spoke of a hard life. His smile didn't touch his eyes, which were cold and unblinking, like a predator sizing up its prey. "That's me," Samuel replied, trying to keep his tone light, though his heart was pounding in his chest. "You guys from the station?" "Not exactly," the taller man said, his voice too smooth, too practiced, like a salesman pitching a lie. He was lean, with sharp features and eyes that seemed to see right through Samuel. "We're contractors, here to assess the situation." Contractors? Samuel's mind raced. The Forest Service didn't outsource fire response. Not that he'd ever heard of. He'd been in the Gila for months, and he'd never seen anyone but rangers and the occasional supply pilot. Contractors didn't fit, and the way these men carried themselves, too calm, too confident, set off every alarm in his head. He asked for their credentials, keeping his tone casual, but they waved him off with a dismissive gesture. "No need to worry," the shorter man said, his smile widening into something that made Samuel's skin crawl, a grin that showed too many teeth. "We've got it under control. You just stay here." It was a command, not a suggestion, and it was Samuel's cue to ignore them entirely. As soon as they started hiking toward the fire, he grabbed his binoculars and tracked them, his hands steady despite the tremor in his chest. They weren't heading for the blaze. Instead, they veered toward an area marked as restricted on his maps, a zone he'd always assumed was off-limits due to old mining claims or hazardous terrain. The restricted zone was a blank spot on his charts, a void of information that had never seemed important until now. It was a place the rangers never mentioned, a place the maps refused to name, and Samuel had never thought to question it. Now he couldn't stop. The men moved with purpose, their strides long and deliberate, as if they knew exactly where they were going. They disappeared into the forest, swallowed by the pines, and Samuel's unease blossomed into outright fear. He considered driving down the mountain to the ranger station, but his truck, a rusted Ford that coughed more than it ran, was unreliable at best, its engine prone to stalling on the steep, rocky roads. Besides, abandoning his post was grounds for termination, and Samuel wasn't ready to throw away the only thing keeping him sane. Instead, he kept his binoculars glued to the restricted zone, his eyes burning from the strain, the lenses fogging with his breath. The forest around the restricted zone was different, even from a distance. The pines there were taller, their branches gnarled and twisted, as if they'd been shaped by a malevolent hand. The air seemed heavier, the light dimmer, as if the sun itself refused to touch that place. Samuel watched for hours, his hands cramping around the binoculars, but the men didn't reappear. The fire continued to burn in the distance, its spiral pattern growing more defined, more deliberate, as if it were a message written in flames. Samuel's mind raced with possibilities. Arson? A cover-up? Something worse? But he had no answers, only questions that gnawed at him like a hungry beast. He didn't see the men again until sunset, when the sky was streaked with crimson and gold, the forest bathed in a bloody glow. They emerged from the restricted zone, their yellow suits stained with dirt and something darker, something that glistened in the fading light. They were carrying something between them, a shape that at first Samuel thought was a large animal, a deer, maybe, or an elk. But the shape was wrong, too angular, too human. He focused his binoculars, his breath catching in his throat, and his stomach flipped. It was a man, or what was left of one. His head lolled back at an impossible angle, his neck bent in a way that no living person's could be. His chest was a mess of red and white, the fabric of his shirt torn to shreds, his ribs exposed like the bars of a cage. The taller man had him slung over his shoulder like a sack of grain, his body limp and lifeless, his arms dangling with a sickening sway. Samuel dropped the binoculars, his hands trembling, the metal clattering against the desk. He grabbed the pistol from its case, his fingers fumbling with the lock, the .45 cold and heavy in his hand. The logical part of him screamed to stay hidden, to lock the door and wait for help, to pretend he hadn't seen what he'd seen. But instinct was louder, a primal urge that drove him to act. He crept down the stairs of the tower, moving as quietly as he could manage, the wood groaning softly under his weight, each creak a betrayal in the stillness. By the time he reached the ground, the men were almost out of sight, heading toward a pickup truck parked on a dirt track that shouldn't have existed. A track that wasn't on any of his maps, a track that seemed to materialize out of nowhere. The smarter move would have been to retreat, to radio the station again, to hike out on foot and find help. But something compelled Samuel to follow, a mix of fear and fury and a desperate need to understand. He stayed far enough back that he could barely make them out, sticking to the trees, his boots silent on the pine needles, the forest closing in around him like a living thing. The air was thick with the scent of smoke and decay, the pines whispering secrets as he moved. When the men reached the truck, they dumped the body into the bed like it was trash, the thud of flesh against metal echoing through the forest, a sound that made Samuel's stomach lurch. They climbed in and drove off, leaving a plume of dust behind, the truck's black frame disappearing into the dusk. It had no plates, no markings, just a void on wheels, a shadow that swallowed the light. The hatch in the scorched earth, a descent into darkness. Samuel should have turned back. He should have radioed the station, or hiked out to the nearest town, or done anything other than what he did next. But fear doesn't always lead to rational choices, and curiosity has a way of overriding common sense, especially when it's fueled by the kind of terror that Samuel felt in that moment. He decided to investigate the area the men had come from, the restricted zone that had swallowed them for hours, the place where the forest seemed to hold its breath. The restricted zone was about 2 miles from his tower, a grueling trek through overgrown trails littered with debris, fallen branches, rocks, and patches of thorny underbrush that clawed at his legs. The forest here was different, denser, darker, the air thick with the scent of pine and something sharper, something chemical that stung his nostrils. The pines loomed overhead, their branches gnarled and twisted, their needles forming a canopy that blocked out the sun, casting the trail in perpetual shadow. Samuel's boots crunched on the dry earth, each step echoing in the stillness, the sound amplified by the oppressive quiet. There were no birds here, no squirrels, no signs of life, just the forest watching, waiting. He reached a clearing where the ground had been scorched black, the earth itself seeming to recoil from whatever had happened here. The air smelled of burnt chemicals and rot, a stench that clawed at Samuel's throat, making his eyes water. The clearing was unnaturally circular, its edges sharp and defined, as if it had been carved out by a deliberate hand. At the center was a metal hatch, partially obscured by debris, broken branches, clumps of dirt, and a scattering of pine needles that seemed to have been placed there to hide it. The hatch was rusted, its surface pitted with age, but it was intact, its edges sealed tight against the earth. Samuel stood there for a long moment, his heart pounding, the pistol heavy in his hand. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to leave this place and never return. But the pull of the unknown was too strong. He approached the hatch, his boots sinking into the scorched earth, the ground soft and yielding beneath him. The hatch was locked, but the padlock was old and rusted, its metal flaking under his touch. He raised his boot and brought it down hard, the impact sending a jolt up his leg. The padlock snapped open with a metallic groan, the sound echoing through the clearing like a gunshot. The hatch creaked as he lifted it, the hinges protesting with a scream of rusted metal, revealing a ladder that descended into darkness. The air that wafted up from below was cold, damp, and thick with the smell of decay, a stench that made Samuel gag. He told himself he'd only go down far enough to see what was inside. A quick look, then he'd leave and report everything to the authorities. But curiosity has a way of overriding common sense, and Samuel was already too far gone to turn back. The ladder was cold and slick, its rungs coated with a thin layer of moisture that made his hands slip as he descended. The darkness swallowed him, the light from the clearing above shrinking to a pinprick as he went deeper. He reached the bottom, his boots hitting concrete with a dull thud, and found himself in a narrow corridor lit by flickering fluorescent lights, their hum a low, constant drone that set his teeth on edge. The walls were concrete, stained with something dark and oily that glistened in the dim light, the stains forming patterns that seemed to shift and writhe when he looked at them too long. The air was colder here, the chill seeping into his bones, and the smell of decay intensified with each step, a miasma of rot that clung to his skin. The first room he came to was a lab of some kind, its tables lined with vials, jars, and surgical tools that gleamed with a sterile menace. The vials were filled with liquids of varying colors, yellow, green, a deep crimson that looked too much like blood. The jars held specimens, unidentifiable masses of tissue floating in formaldehyde, their shapes distorted and grotesque. In the corner was a metal table with restraints, the straps stained a dark brown, the leather cracked and peeling, the metal beneath rusted with age. Samuel's stomach churned, the bile rising in his throat, but he forced himself to keep going, his flashlight beam darting across the room, illuminating horrors he wished he could unsee. Further down the corridor, he found a storage room, its door ajar, the hinges creaking as he pushed it open. Inside were metal barrels labeled with cryptic codes, strings of letters and numbers that meant nothing to him. X, 47B, K, 19, Z03. The barrels were rusted, their surfaces pitted with age, but they were sealed tight, their lids bolted shut. Samuel pried one open, the lid screeching in protest, the sound echoing through the bunker like a scream. The stench that hit him nearly knocked him over, a wave of rot and chemicals that made his eyes water and his stomach heave. The barrel was filled with body parts, human body parts, arms, legs, torsos, all hacked to pieces and swimming in a viscous, yellowish fluid. The limbs were pale, the skin mottled with decay, the cuts clean and precise, as if made by a surgeon's hand. Samuel staggered back, choking on bile, his mind reeling with the horror of what he'd found. That was when he heard footsteps, not the echo of his own, but deliberate, heavy steps coming from deeper within the bunker. He froze, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst, the sound a deafening drum in his ears. He ducked behind a stack of barrels, his hand tightening around the pistol, the metal slick with his sweat. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until he could hear the faint rasp of breathing, a sound that was too human and not human enough. A shadow fell across the doorway, long and distorted, stretching across the concrete like a stain. Samuel caught a glimpse of the shorter man from earlier, the contractor with the leathery face. He was carrying a machete, its blade smeared with something dark, the metal glinting in the flickering light. The man stopped in the doorway, sniffing the air like an animal, his head tilting as if he could sense Samuel's presence, his eyes scanning the darkness with a predator's intent. Samuel's hand tightened around the pistol, his finger hovering over the trigger, but he didn't dare move. His breath was shallow, his chest tight, the air in the bunker suddenly too thin. After what felt like an eternity, the man turned and walked away, his footsteps fading into the distance, the rasp of his breathing lingering like a ghost. The moment he was out of sight, Samuel bolted. He sprinted back down the corridor, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly, the shadows lunging at him from every angle. He climbed the ladder, his hands slipping on the rungs, his boots scraping against the metal, and burst out into the clearing, the fresh air hitting him like a slap. He didn't stop running until he reached his tower, his lungs on fire, his legs trembling with exhaustion. He locked the door, shoved a cabinet against it, and collapsed into a chair, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the pistol. For hours he sat there, staring at the door, waiting for it to burst open, waiting for the man with the machete to come for him. The forest outside was silent, the kind of silence that presses down on you, heavy and suffocating. The wind had stopped, the coyotes had gone quiet, and even the crickets seemed to hold their breath. Samuel's mind raced, replaying the horrors he'd seen, the lab, the barrels, the body parts, the man with the machete. He tried to make sense of it, to find a rational explanation, but there was none. He was in over his head, and he knew it. The aftermath and the truth, a shadow that never fades. At dawn, Samuel ventured outside, the forest eerily quiet, the air thick with the scent of smoke and pine. The column of smoke had disappeared, as if it had never been, the spiral pattern erased from the landscape. He scanned the horizon with his binoculars, but there was no sign of the men or their truck, no trace of the fire that had burned so fiercely the night before. The hatch, however, was still there, a dark scar in the clearing, a reminder of the nightmare he'd uncovered, its rusted surface glinting in the morning light. Samuel made his decision. He packed his gear, his clothes, his logbook, a few cans of food, left a note in the radio log, found evidence of illegal activity in restricted zone, leaving post to report to authorities, and hiked out. It took him 2 days to reach the nearest town, a small outpost called Silver City, where the streets were lined with dusty bars and general stores, the air filled with the hum of cicadas. He went straight to the sheriff's office, a squat building with peeling paint and a single deputy at the desk, and reported everything. He told them about the fire, the contractors, the body, the hatch, the bunker, the barrels filled with body parts. The deputy listened, his face impassive, and nodded, promising to investigate. Samuel left the office feeling hollow, the weight of what he'd seen pressing down on him like a stone. Weeks later, Samuel got a call from the Forest Service. They thanked him for his vigilance but assured him there was no evidence of any wrongdoing. The area he'd described was, according to them, restricted due to hazardous materials testing, a government project classified, nothing to worry about. They said he must have misinterpreted what he saw, that the stress of the job had gotten to him, that the solitude had played tricks on his mind. Samuel listened to their excuses, his jaw tight, and hung up without a word. He knew what he saw. He'd seen the body, the lab, the barrels, the man with the machete. He wasn't crazy, no matter what they said. Months later, he heard rumors. Whispers among the locals in Silver City about missing hikers, strange sightings, and unmarked trucks moving through the forest at night. An old man at a bar, his hands gnarled from years of ranching, told Samuel about a hiker who'd vanished near Mullion Baldy the previous year. His pack found torn to shreds, his body never recovered. A waitress at a diner mentioned lights in the sky, strange orbs that moved too fast to be planes, hovering over the restricted zone before disappearing into the night. Samuel tried digging into the history of the restricted zone, spending hours at the local library, poring over old maps and newspaper clippings, but every lead turned into a dead end. The zone was a black hole, a void that swallowed information as easily as it had swallowed the men with the body. It was only years later, through an old friend in the Forest Service, a man named Tom who'd worked with Samuel during his training, that he learned the truth. Tom met Samuel at a diner in Albuquerque, his face pale, his hands trembling as he slid a manila folder across the table. Inside were grainy photos of the restricted zone, taken from a helicopter showing the hatch and the scorched clearing. There were also reports, heavily redacted, mentioning a man named Carlton Doofus, a former biologist turned black market organ harvester. The shorter man, the one with the machete, was Carlton, a predator who'd used the restricted zone as his base of operations, hidden under the guise of government testing. The victims were vagrants, loners, people who wouldn't be missed. Hitchhikers picked up on lonely highways, drifters who wandered too close to the Gila. The fire had been a cover to erase evidence, a deliberate act to burn away the traces of Carlton's crimes, the spiral pattern a signature of his madness. Carlton was never caught. The Forest Service claimed they'd raided the bunker, but it was empty by the time they arrived. The barrels gone, the lab stripped clean. Carlton had vanished, a ghost in the wilderness, leaving behind only rumors and fear. Tom warned Samuel to stop digging, to let it go, but Samuel couldn't. He kept the folder, hiding it in a locked drawer, and sometimes late at night, he'd take it out and stare at the photos, the redacted reports, trying to piece together the puzzle. He wondered how close he'd come to being Carlton's next victim, how thin the line had been between survival and oblivion. The shadows that never fade, a haunting legacy. Samuel Shio never returned to the Gila National Forest. He left the fire lookout job behind, trading the solitude of the wilderness for the noise of the city. He moved to Albuquerque, where the hum of traffic and the glow of streetlights drowned out the memories of the forest. But the Gila never left him. Sometimes, late at night, he dreams of the hatch, of the flickering lights and the barrels filled with horrors. He hears the footsteps, the rasp of breathing, and sees the machete glinting in the dark, the leathery face of Carlton Doofus staring at him with those cold, unblinking eyes. He wakes in a cold sweat, his heart pounding, the pistol he keeps under his pillow a cold comfort in his hand. The Gila National Forest is still out there, its canyons and cliffs hiding secrets that no map can reveal. The restricted zone remains off-limits, its purpose shrouded in mystery, a black spot on the landscape that the Forest Service refuses to acknowledge. The locals in Silver City still whisper about missing hikers, about lights in the sky, about a man with a machete who hunts in the shadows. And somewhere, perhaps, Carlton Doofus is still out there, his blade stained with the blood of the forgotten, his laughter echoing through the pines. So, reader, I ask you again, could you endure the isolation of a fire tower, knowing something malevolent watches from the trees? Would you have the courage to descend into the unknown, even if it meant facing the unspeakable? The wilderness is not ours. It belongs to what we cannot understand. And sometimes, we are just passing through their territory, leaving shadows that never fade. This story is one of many we've uncovered on The Forbidden Excavation, a YouTube channel dedicated to true horror stories, scary tales to read in the dark, and sleep stories that will keep you awake long into the night. Samuel Shio's experience in the Gila National Forest is a chilling reminder that the wilderness holds more than beauty. It holds terror, waiting in the shadows, whispering through the pines. If you enjoyed this tale, subscribe to our channel for more true horror odysseys, and share your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done in Samuel's place? Would you have opened the hatch or turned back? Until next time, stay safe and watch your back.